A lot of what I'm going to go over is in the docs on the domain certificates proxies page. I'm working on a video guide of this, but this is a pretty lengthy page. So we have mainly two options for just a regular relayer, kind of a real domain name like we saw here, relayer.masterhw.cloud or whatever your domain is. Option one is essentially just directly registering your IP to your like DNS record, and then getting a certificate of that from your DNS provider or from Cloudflare, and then just dropping that straight in here. So if you did custom SSL certificate, then you can choose the files for where those are. If you provide those files that you just got from your DNS provider or Cloudflare, if you choose to go that path, then the relayer itself will be providing the certificate that you see up here in this kind of corner. Yeah, there we go. Here we can actually see it. Most browsers have that kind of thing, or if you click on the lock, you can actually get to see the certificate itself. However, what I have done and what I encourage all of you who are at the partner level doing this to kind of do is option two, which is a bit more comprehensive, but it's a lot more powerful and liberating in a sense. So this is using Cloudflare and a proxy. So a proxy, Jay, could you help us out just quickly with a brief definition of what a proxy is and why it's useful?
A proxy is a front end. It sits in front of the Minio or any web service. And most proxies can do the SSL offload for you. So encrypted connections will go from the client side to the proxy, at which point the SSL will be offloaded, and then it'll go via HTTP internally to the actual service. So they can be useful when you're trying to provide HTTP access to something that isn't natively HTTPS or doesn't have the ability to add certificates. There's various other things you can do with proxies. So if you need to do load balancing, they can come in very useful. So you can have one proxy front end and then two back end servers where the client will get connected to the one that's working currently or the one that's less resource starved, or things like blocking any IP connections that come in that aren't destined for the exact host name or coming from countries that you definitely don't want to deal with.
I like proxies because they can do a lot of different things. That's why they can be difficult to describe or to kind of define, because they're good at a couple different things. It kind of clicked for me a bit when I thought of them almost as like a software router a little bit. We're used to the concept of port forwarding, where you log into your router and you say, hey, I want all of the traffic coming into this port, just send it straight to this machine. If you have a proxy running on that machine, you can then kind of do things another level deeper, and you can say all of the traffic that's coming in and it's using jeff.relayer.cloud or something, send it to specifically that machine on this network. But if it's j.relayer.cloud, send it to this other machine. Like it's good for kind of traffic rules or traffic routing. The gist of it is that if you just make a Cloudflare account, you set it up properly, you need to make some tokens because the proxy itself accesses your Cloudflare. The way that it's able to generate certificates is using authentication based on your Cloudflare account. But here I have a basic domain registered in Cloudflare, masterhw.cloud, and I make these DNS records. So relayer.masterhw.cloud goes to this IP. This is the IP that my relayer is running on. And then I have relayer-admin pointing to this DNS record, which is pointing at this IP. So that's a little indirect, but in order to, by this pointing at the one above it, which is pointing at this, then I only have to change one IP if my IP were to change instead of changing both these records. What we do with this really long docker compose.yml, this essentially resembles actually the one that we went over earlier in the call. So we can see our XNS relayer container. We can see what we talked about earlier with the cache and the ports and the end file. This is all the same as what you should already have for a basic relayer, but we add these new lines. And this is all the traffic stuff. There's just a couple copy paste stuff. So relayer.yourdomain, relayer.admin.yourdomain. Obviously, relayer is the Minio port, relayer admin is the UI port. So this is kind of readable. Hopefully, even if you don't speak this language, you can kind of see what it's talking about or what it's doing. And then at the bottom here, the Cloudflare account that you created, you have your email address, and you have to create a DNS API token, and then you just paste that there. And after all of that, if you do the classic docker compose up -d, then oh, and you also have to do a port forward. So HTTPS ports, if you try to access a website using like HTTPS, it's going for a certificate. That's using port 443. So the regular plain non-certificate HTTP port is 80. But if you're using secure HTTPS that has SSL and all that, then it's using, oh, here it was. It's using port 443. So that's what that's about. You also need to set up that port forward. But once you've done that, anyway, then you get the lock icon when you access your relayer, which is kind of neat. And if I pull up my Docker Compose here, you can see this is the relayer this is the container that we were looking at earlier. This just looks like a normal relayer, but then this is all different. And we can see relayer.masterhw.cloud, relayer admin, and all that we were just talking about. So what that lets me do, like that was all nice to hear about, but what does that actually get me? That lets us do stuff like, since we set this bucket to be publicly shareable, then if I generate this link, then that was how, like even here, let me do this in incognito. So I'm not signed in. I have no authentication in place. Publicly shared links can be opened by anyone over the internet, which is cool. Even if I chop off all that, that's how I was still able to access this, and it loads like a normal website. It has the connection secure, all that, which is pretty cool. So that was what was really happening in the background when I showed you that earlier. It means that if you're providing to a customer, you're providing an endpoint, it lets it look like a real endpoint, like it resembles a traditional cloud, not just a random like IP address. And this is a big one. It lets you get a SSL certificate. And oh, click the wrong button there. It lets you get an SSL certificate, and these are required for a lot of S3 software. So HTTPS connections are kind of mandatory, I think, for Veeam and for a lot of others. To get a certificate these days, you pretty much have to have a domain. Another thing, so if we go with Cloudflare directly, Cloudflare, Jay, could you kind of give us a skinny on what role does Cloudflare play in the modern internet? Because a lot of people would consider it kind of a backbone.
Yeah, I mean, in its original sense, they were essentially a dark fiber network where they would take ingress from other ISPs routed through their much quicker network and then out to the destination. After that, they started adding their proxy functions, so edge caching and making sure that data is close to where it needs to get. In the case of traffic, as in the traffic proxy, it's also using the Let's Encrypt DNS challenge. So that's where the API token comes into play. But it's not actually adding a DNS record per se. It does add one in here very quickly. It's called a text record, just to verify that you actually own the domain. So that's what the API token and the traffic setup is for. It's only to verify that you're actually allowed to generate a certificate for that domain, because obviously you don't want people to be able to generate certificates for domains they don't own. So making sure the person has access to add DNS records to it is one way of doing it.
If somebody were to connect to my relayer right now, they go to relayer.masterhw.cloud. So the request is first hitting Cloudflare. Well, it's doing the DNS resolution. So it's, since I have my DNS registered through Cloudflare, then first their computer's looking up what even is masterhw.cloud. Like, who do I direct? What IP is that ultimately resolving to? That's going through Cloudflare.
Mm-hmm.
The traffic that it's, when it's then saying, okay, I'm going to load relayer.masterhw.cloud, I'm going to load that web page. It's sending that request through Cloudflare, but to my IP. But where there's an extra layer of security is they don't actually get access. They don't know what this IP is, do they?
It's right. If right now I pinged relay.masterhw.cloud, I wouldn't see that 99.239 address. I'd see an
Yeah.
IP address on Cloudflare's network. And interestingly, depending on where you ping that address from, you could potentially get different IP addresses because
Right.
Cloudflare
So
will route.
you pinging it from New Zealand, you might get a different server than
That's right.
someone
Yeah.
like Jeff in New York City. So
Yeah.
that's kind of an interesting security layer. So in a lot of ways, this has kind of DDoS protection built in because they don't actually know what your IP is, or they can't see directly where it is. And Cloudflare in general also has very beefy servers and built-in DDoS protection. So
Mhm.
that's kind of another benefit to using it. And then the proxy layer itself. Oh, just while I have this up. Uh, so yeah, this is my kind of relayer folder. I looked at the folders in there, and because we had traffic set up in our Docker Compose YML, we can see a traffic folder. And if I open it, we see Let's Encrypt. So if I open that Let's Encrypt, I think, yeah, this would be my certificate. But that would be where it ends up. So Let's Encrypt is just the kind of service that it uses to generate and store that SSL certificate. But that's all kind of happening within the proxy, and it's just kind of a neat dance that the proxy does with Cloudflare in order to give you like a more secure experience, have some basic protections for your infrastructure, so things like the IP are never directly exposed, and then things like the proxy service. So you can turn this off, um, and what this would do is this would actually make it so now if you were to ping relayer.masterhw.cloud, is that right, Jay, that this would
Yeah.
directly resolve to this IP? Okay.
That's right, and it would take its normal route across the internet. So, whatever your
Right.
upstream provider routes to other countries or other places, it would follow that network rather than go internally through Cloudflare.
Right. So this is arguably, well, it's just there might be reasons why you want to do DNS only and not have Cloudflare's proxy.
Mhm.
Um, it's just kind of a trade off, I guess, that you want to make because you are, by having this proxied, you are using Cloudflare's infrastructure, which is great most of the time, but there is, I mean, we do see a headline every couple months that some major like big tech provider had a hiccup and like 30% of the internet's websites were knocked off for a couple minutes kind of thing. That would potentially expose you to that kind of risk. But Cloudflare, arguably, like I'm not a Cloudflare salesman, but arguably Cloudflare is so integral to the internet anyway that there would, if Cloudflare's proxy tunnels start failing, there's a huge problem on the on the internet in general. But that is a consideration that you are piggybacking off of someone else's infrastructure, and there's definitely reasons why you might not want to do that.
Mhm.
But by using the proxy, you're also getting Cloudflare's content distribution network, which is nice. So if I were to turn this back on, and one of you or even myself were to download, I mean, this is a pretty small file, like 4 megs, but if we download that file through here, then this has now loaded through Cloudflare's uh, like content distribution servers. And now anyone else that downloads this folder or that downloads this file for the next little bit is actually going to be pulling it directly from Cloudflare themselves and not actually hitting your machine. So there's some kind of interesting CDN reasons why that would be advantageous. So you're not. So in theory, you could be serving a pretty large file to a ton of people and only really be having to upload it one time, and then everyone else that accesses it is hitting it from Cloudflare's cache, which is kind of neat. So this is all a bit more advanced stuff, but uh, it's good to know that this is a thing that you can look into later if you want to start looking into performance optimizations, getting some things like DDoS protection. Cloudflare is pretty ubiquitous, and this is all free. They do have paid tiers, but you can do all of this without any cost.